Hello. Hello. Great that you've all come back after lunch. And there was no alcohol, so everybody's awake. This is good. This morning there were three, I think, really important interventions. One from Chief Stacey Laforme of the Mississaugas, on whose territory we are. Another from Justin Weep. I think, Justin, you're back there, aren't you? There's Justin. Louder, okay. From the Trillium Foundation for Foreigners, that's the big Ontario government foundation. And another from Andrea Chris John of the Toronto Council Fire Native Cultural Centre. And where did you... There you are, with a number of younger people from the foundation, from the Council Fire. And of course the order is never right, because you have to start a conversation somewhere. And in a way they were saying we should have started with Indigenous people, and in a way we should have, but once we'd said it was going to be walls, bridges, homes, you couldn't start. I mean, the walls, it's the wrong place to put this conversation. So it's the second one. But I think those interventions were incredibly important, as were a number of interventions last night. And it reminds us of two things. And one of them is that, for those who are not from Canada, that Canadians have become increasingly aware of all that was done wrong by the Canadian government and the Canadian people and the Canadian bureaucracy over the last 150 years vis-a-vis Indigenous people. And that very, very, very slowly things are coming around, led by the courts and then by politicians, but above all led by Indigenous people, things like the I Don't Know More movement and so on. This is a very long process, and way too long to deal with things like clean water and proper schools and on reserves and so on. But there's a whole other side which this panel is much more, this group is much more about, which is that one must not be simply focused on everything that's wrong, that needs to be fixed, and forget that for thousands of years this has been the place of Indigenous peoples, and that when people like me started arriving here 500 years ago or so, we were not simply welcomed in sort of like welcome, we came into a completely different civilization, society, where for centuries, 2 to 3 centuries, Indigenous people made life possible for the immigrants, for the settlers. And that generosity, but it's not just the generosity, it's a different philosophy of how societies function. And it's not for me to say this, and other people are going to say it, but this sort of idea that there is the question of family and of community and of relationship to land, which is very, very different from the concepts of the people arriving. So you have these centuries of a relationship being developed, a conversation happening before it was totally betrayed, sometime in the 19th century. And the influence of Indigenous peoples on what would happen here for the best, not the bad stuff, the good stuff, was enormous over those centuries. As people know, I've argued that our entire immigration policy, immigration citizenship policy, at its best, not its worst, at its best, we owe entirely to Indigenous peoples. And I can go through subject after subject showing the influence of Indigenous peoples on laws, on all sorts of areas. And now we're in this interesting moment of trying to put it all back together again, both urgently when it's about water, but also in a more complex way when it's about, what is the conversation? How does the conversation work? And in a way, what is the original conversation of the northern half of North America, which we call Canada? The original conversation is a conversation between the people who are here and the people who came here and are still coming here, between Indigenous peoples and newcomers. Of course, it gets more and more complicated, but that is the conversation, which is the interesting conversation about what's happened here. And so we have this is an attempt to come back to that. And just before I do the next thing, I want to just point out that we haven't said a word about it yet. We're going to have a conversation about it after this. This extraordinary painting and the drawings and sketches of it. And of course, as many people know, they're by Kent Monkman and Kent is sitting right there, and is, of course, Indigenous. So, here we have a group, Nadine, Caron, Anishinaabe, an Italian, first female First Nations general surgeon in Canada, and who links together in a way the North and the South because she's working between Prince George and the University of British Columbia. Ahmad Ramadan, Syrian-born, arrived in 2014, so within a year or so of citizenship, if he wants it. You know, a very, very interesting first novel, The Clothesline Swing, came out, what, this year, early this year?
May.
In May, yeah, which everybody is talking about. LGBTQ refugee, which is I think a very important, you know, way of putting it because it makes people say, right. You know, and when I was president of Penn, we were dealing with these combinations very often. He was marshal of the 2016 Vancouver Pride Parade, which is a great honor, and works at the Vancouver Food Bank. Niigaan Sinclair, Anishinaabe from Little Peguis, St. Peter's. And he's the head of the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. And of course, central to a wonderful book, The Winter We Danced, central to the whole Idle No More movement, one of the most important Indigenous voices in the country. Ausma Malik, who is from Mississauga. Toronto. But, and is in one of the most difficult jobs there is, which is to be an elected trustee of the Toronto School Board, biggest school board in the country, and for this area, so you're on her territory in a way. You know? Her ward. And is a really well-known human rights social justice activist. And then Fabrice from Montreal, who's co-founder and executive director of Pour les Trois Points, which is this amazing organization which trains basically volunteer coaches to become life coaches for kids, because he identified the fact that the people who had the best chance at getting to kids who are in marginalized, difficult situations was not through sports, but through their coaches. Not their phys ed school people, but their volunteer coaches. And so it's a very, very interesting thing. But he's also a columnist at the great Montreal intellectual newspaper, Le Devoir. And there we are. So what do you... So I said this, you know, this is about bridges, which is one of those words that sounds self-evident. I said recently that I thought that we had to be careful, and this morning's conversation showed how complex it is to try and use words, say, in English or in French, and you think they're universal words, and they're not universal words. They have many different meanings. That for me, a bridge, in common parlance, is usually the European sense that there are rivers which are dividing armies, which are trying to conquer nations, and that they're dividing throughout Europe. And we have centuries and centuries of armies trying to get across rivers and not succeeding or succeeding. And bridges are these little hopes that you could turn the rivers into a non-divisive thing. And this really isn't true about this place, because the whole history of this place is that the only way you got anywhere was by rivers, and that rivers are in fact the bridges. That the place is joined together by the rivers, not divided by the rivers. So philosophically and physically, it's a very different thing. And again, it comes out of the Indigenous experience. So I just thought, what do you think of bridges? What do you think of bridges? Why don't we start here?
Well, I think bridges, I like the philosophical, and I'm the optimistic type of person. So I look at bridges that join a space, join a place, join a group of people, and even join ideas that don't naturally join easily, and help to connect those two. And I think that they're connectable otherwise, but that connection may not be found without the presence and the assistance and individuals who have the courage to build those bridges.
So, I feel like 1,000 eyes looking at my back of my neck.
There's only about 100.
All right.
We did try to get swivel chairs, by the way. We tried to get swivel chairs, but anyway.
All right. I believe that bridges are built from both sides of the river. I see bridges as a way for two people to come together and build the connection between the two of them. And when bridges are built, the most beautiful thing about them is that they take you both ways. They take you from this side of the river to the other one, as well as take you from vice versa, basically. And I believe that this allows for a social and economical and a culture exchange that otherwise, without that bridge, wouldn't happen.
Fabrice.
Yeah, well, I do agree that the bridge is a way to connect groups that are separated from one part of the other. But also when I'm thinking about how to build a bridge, there's the part of contribution, and I can imagine that different groups have different responsibilities in building bridges. And also, I would tend to say that there are bridges that are necessary because there are natural gaps, but also there are some that are, I would say, artificial gaps and that are created. So as we think about building bridges, we should definitely think about the intent that we have in connecting with others, but also do the deep work of thinking about why are there gaps in the first place. And in our societies, that is needed as well.
That's well.
I also want to apologize for the people behind me. I probably won't do a good job about turning around regularly. Well, I want to echo what everyone said so far. You know, bridges are about connection. There definitely have to be two sides to it that are participating, but I think also benefiting from that bridge. And I think most of all, people build bridges, right? They aren't just a thing that happen or that are naturally occurring. There has to be a real intention, a collaboration. There has to be resources that go into it. There has to be an idea about what the design of that bridge might look like. And I think that all of those components are really important in whether we make an effective bridge that lasts over time and that continues to contribute and be of benefit to everyone, or whether it's a bridge that is very time limited and gone.
Niigaan.
Oh, so bonjour and way maganaduk, Niigaan way with cost, Namago Shinto dem, and Eman Wendam Omai in St. Peter's and Donchi, little Bungie Pegwis and Donchi. In Dinaway Maganaduk, Gaween, Nawicha Waganuk. Let me say that again. So in Dinaway Maganaduk, Gaween, Nawicha Waganuk. If you understand the difference between that, you understand what a bridge is. So bridges are about the concept of family and collective responsibility, not friends and individual rights-based monologue sort of concepts. And that for me is what a bridge really is a bridge is the concept that we share gifts collectively and that my benefit is only beneficial on the benefit of others. And that when we go to the airport and we welcome people in, we're saying not you are a foreigner, that you are home.
So I'm going to go back to you because we've had this conversation in a number of countries, and I think I asked Niigaan to just go a little further on all of that. I mean, I think that, you know, it's very interesting when you know, a First Nations leader is welcoming people to say they're home, which has real and deep meaning, which is perhaps not understood clearly in mainstream media or in the way politics are talked about, or even the way history has been mainly taught. So, I mean, can you frame that a little more?
So, I mean, we've talked many times in many different places, all the way overseas to here, and about what it means to both what comes into multiculturalism policy, what are the premises, and really all the shiny things that Canada thinks is Canadian are truly Indigenous in nature, and they come from the interactions with Indigenous people. And those don't come from anywhere. They don't come from nowhere. They come from everywhere. What I mean by that is, in our creation stories, we were accepted in by those entities in creation who came and prepared the home before us. They took care of the land, they took care of the sky and the air and the directions. All of those things had been prepared, and as human beings, we believe as Anishinaabe, and I want to acknowledge, of course, that we are on Mississauga territory and that these stories also belong in this place as relatives in this territory. I come, of course, from the Anishinaabe in Manitowoc, Manitoba. But our creation story states that we joined the party, we weren't the party. If you understand that, you understand the basic premise of 150 years of violence and genocide. Is that we keep having this consistent and ongoing delusion that we are the only meaning makers in creation. But for us as Anishinaabe, we were accepted in and adopted in by those in which that took care of us and gave us our names and gave us our totems, everything I just said a minute ago. Those were the bridges for us when we entered into this place, when we were created, when we were set down in this place, Anishinaabe, when we were set down. And that makes us who we are. And so when Europeans showed up, it wasn't the end of times. It wasn't anything earth-shatteringly new. It was like encountering a new species, or it was like encountering a new place. It was like those beings had to be named and cared for and then adopted in and taught the ways in which life had been gifted to us. And that's why we offered to them our names and offered to them our lives and our commitment as family members, as Indinoe Maganaduk, those beings that sound like us, which is what I greeted you all as. And that us, as family members, upon that being picked up, because a gift is only valuable insofar that it's received. The misunderstanding of that gift is that settlers were responsible to gift back as well. And there is where things fall apart. What things fall apart is that for the first 200 years, we were the predominant gift givers. And now those gifts have yet to ever be returned, or if they are returned, it's $5 a year in a rather embarrassingly moment of what we might call treaty. And that's what we think treaty is. But treaty is not about human beings. Human beings are the appendix of treaty. It is about our relationships with the non-human beings and that our relationships with ourselves, that is what treaty constitutes. And so for me, bridges are about trying to understand the ways in which not only can we have relationships, but frankly, it doesn't matter if we have the best relationships in the six of us in the middle of the circle with all of our other relatives out there. It doesn't matter if we have nothing to drink. It doesn't matter if we have no place to live. It doesn't matter if we have nothing to eat or clothes to wear and a relationship with the non-human relatives out there. And so for me, that is what a bridge is. A bridge is a way for us to see law in this place, which we refer to as Enawendowin. We are all related. And understanding that Wawiak, we are a part of a bigger system and everything has a place in that system. And that is what a bridge is all about. And that's why we go to the airport. That's why I'm on the board of the Manitoba Islamic Social Services Agency. That is why it's crucial for me that when new immigrants come in, whether they're in for 10 minutes or whether they're in for 10 generations, that they understand that they are part of a broad network and, dare I say, a civilization, that perhaps they have it takes time to learn that. It takes time to learn about the way life operates in this place, and it's about having responsibilities. When you receive that name and when you receive that role in the family, that you have then a role to play to gift back as much as you've received.
So I think it's interesting to go straight from that to the most recent arrival to be welcomed, which is Danny. And then we just, now I think we've got a sort of a shape for this conversation. So this is now just break in at any time, right? This is a conversation. So Danny, I mean, how do you feel about that? You've heard that, I know you're from Vancouver now, so you're a Vancouverite, and a Vancouverite is very different from a Torontonian because for many reasons, but one of the, and well, you of course you're partly of a Vancouverite, but one of the reasons is that the Indigenous presence is so much clearer there than it is in Toronto, in spite of the fact there's a big Indigenous community in Toronto, but the city kind of swarms it in a way. But how do you feel about that, or what effect has it had on you, if any?
It's quite the important topic to me, to be honest, to research and understand the First Nations history, tradition, and heritage, because it includes a feeling that as I came here, I was looking to feel at home. And I felt sometimes that I'm not finding that home, that a lot of people are telling me that this is not my home, either directly or indirectly. And then when I started to learn more about the indigenous folks, about the First Nations folks, about their heritage, I realized that most of the people who I see are folks who came just like me as refugees to this country and were welcomed by the First Nations as such. So knowing that, understanding that concept, understanding that relationship between First Nation folks and myself as a refugee allowed me a clearer image of what home means to me here in Canada. And as every time that I do a speech or every time that I talk about my book or whatever, I always acknowledge the lands that I'm in, because it's not just important to me, but it's so important to the narrative that I bring to my life as a refugee here, as somebody who came here and became an immigrant. I work with a lot of refugees, I work with a lot of immigrants that are coming here to Canada, and I have to admit, before coming here to Canada, I have no idea what a First Nation person is. I had zero knowledge. I did my research about Canada before I came here, but the limited time and the limited resources that I had while I was a refugee in Lebanon didn't allow me access to know more about you and your culture. And when we arrived, we got that booklet with 1 page of information about First Nations people. So basically it was 1 page of information with 2 First Nation people on the cover, and that was about it. But then as I became more and more involved in the community, I started to build friendships and to build understanding and to feel connection also with your heritage, because it's we use magic realism in the way that we tell stories in Syria. And I noticed the same in the way that First Nation people tell their own stories. There's this elements of magic that comes into the way that we tell our heritage and we see ourselves. This stardust of a thing that I think we share, and that made me feel so connected in a way. As I work with a lot of newcomers and refugees, one of the many things that I tell them is I talk to them about First Nations people. I apologize for taking the space to teach, as I believe that someone who's First Nation should be doing that work, but as I am the person who's working with them, I try to bring them that the beginning of the robe of that knowledge and hope that they will continue that knowledge. In Arabic, we call First Nations Sukkan al-Asliyin, the original people who, the word Sakan means found home and found calmness. So the people who came here and found home and calmness here. And that's very important to me to share with the people who come here to Canada and that I support, because I feel that they need to know that those are the folks who are the caretakers of this land, and that to connect to this land, you have to respect those folks.
I just want to say the immigration guide, my students and I worked on it, so it's more now. Still not enough, but we worked on it this year.
There's more coming, isn't it? Aren't they in the
So
middle
yeah,
of it?
after the Hague, I met the officer from immigration in the audience, and they said, hey, can we send you the immigration guide? And so my students and I worked on it, and all summer actually. So it's improving, but still, I think it's only 4 pages now. So 642 nations, 4 pages. That's what we'll leave it at that.
But there's also this, you apologized for teaching something which could be taught by an Indigenous person, but I'm not disagreeing, but there is this other concept, which is the concept of the ally. And I think, you say something about that. I mean, that in a way, it's your job, like it's my job, to be an ally, and therefore to talk about these things, no?
Well, I can sort of look at it from the healthcare lens. I can relate to this specifically through the healthcare lens as Anishinaabe as well. Niigaan and I had a good laugh at that behind the closed doors over there. Essentially, even when you look at the disparities in health and health outcomes in Canada, and you look at the concerns with racism in the healthcare system, and you look at the knowledge gap for healthcare providers in Canada and what we would expect and want and desire for them to know as Indigenous people in Canada when they're caring for our loved ones and what they don't know. Our reliance on international medical graduates and what they're provided in order to provide the healthcare that's optimal, culturally safe, culturally humble, and all of that. We don't have the resources to do it all ourselves as First Nations, as Inuit, as Métis. If you look at the number of Indigenous physicians and other healthcare providers in Canada, we're grossly underrepresented across the board. So we can't be in every hospital room, we can't be in every emergency room, we can't be in every operating room, and so we can engage with people who, one of the chiefs that we work with, that I work with dearly, just says you need to work with people who are Indigenous at heart. That honestly just want to dive in with both feet and just get into the deep end and say, let's swim to the shallow end. Let's find a safe spot, and they're in there for the whole count, and they are your allies. They honestly care about addressing the issues of disparities, of racism, of underrepresentation. They care about it, I know, as much as I do, and you have to search for those people. And maybe if we came from different places, from different countries, different continents, they came across a bridge. And we're on the same side dealing with that issue, and we know that we can safely get to the other side and bring people as they wish, and to travel freely, safely, and get to a safe spot.
So we're going to go to the audience, but I mean, you can either do it right now, but interestingly enough, you're the representatives, you two, of the two biggest urban centers in the country, Toronto and Montreal, which in many ways are the most cut off from this conversation, in spite of the realities inside the city. And so it would be just a very quick response, and then we're going straight to the floor to get some interventions.
Well, building off of what was said, and particularly Niigaan's remarks about, finding our place and all of us figuring out where we belong in what you so beautifully described. And I think, I can speak personally first and foremost, and it's being a child of immigrants. My parents immigrated to Canada in the 1970s, and when they arrived here, this was home. They did not feel that it fraught in any way that this was a place that they were going to build a home, they were going to contribute, they were going to raise a family, and we're no strangers to racism and Islamophobia, but my parents did absolutely everything they could to make sure that we felt that way, and we did. Toronto, Mississauga, where I grew up, and Canada is home. And, very socially justice-oriented family, talking about the important big issues that are happening in the world and in our communities, and figuring out our way to make things better, right? To be people who see oppression and don't participate in it, but seek to fight it and support our neighbors and our communities. And I think for me, as you go through school does not, and I think it's getting better, but definitely does not do a great job in kind of telling us the honest truths about how Canada, that we know it, came to be, and what that violence and colonialism was and looked like, and what its impacts are that continue. And I think for myself, it was definitely a journey in realizing that, we are settlers, right? Whether we're children of immigrants or we've been here for many generations, that we do have to acknowledge that the reasons why so many of us are here are the same root causes of white supremacy and colonialism that pushed us out from where we are from, and that made those places so unsafe that we had to seek out places like Canada. And that is something very important for us to kind of dig deep into, in terms of not just allyship, but I think solidarity as well. And then seeing now that we are here and we have benefited from the privileges of immigration and of not having endured so many generations of genocide and marginalization. So what is our responsibility now as settlers, as treaty people, and as people who are committed to social justice and the future of what this nation is? And I think that was a really important journey for me, and it definitely didn't come easily, and I have to give huge credit to every relationship, friendship, a conversation that that I was invited to have, and where I'm sure I made many mistakes and said many things that were not necessarily on point, but to be able to move that conversation forward is really powerful. And now in this role at the Toronto District School Board, you know, the board has taken a really serious responsibility about the outcomes of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you know, the idea that education is a source of so much of the oppression that we've seen, but also education as being something that can also ameliorate it. And you know, we have taken on the calls about changes to curriculum. There is an Aboriginal Education Centre which, you know, works to infuse the pieces of truth and reconciliation and the history of our lands into everything that is done. But also, you know, that's not enough. Those are just such small things, and we do need partnerships across the established governments. In Ontario, curriculum is ministry mandated, so the province of Ontario has a huge responsibility in that, and there's so many people working to make that happen, but it is something that we have to continue to work at generation to generation. And you know, one small thing that we've done at the TDSB over the last several years is the land acknowledgement. It's almost, you know, embarrassing that it's taken this long to make it a standard practice of everything we do. And it's amazing when I go to schools and we do the land acknowledgement, no matter what the event is or what the issue is we're discussing, there will always be students who are like, why do we do that? And what is the reason behind it? And why don't we have more of that in our classrooms? Why haven't I learned about this in history? And I think that is really amazing, that awareness raising to kind of propel that action, that questioning, and to invite those conversations that take that very personal relationship between us and then actually challenge systems and challenge things that are so deep-seated and insidious in terms of how we've gotten here to actually build those legitimate bridges.
So we've got a lot of questions. Fabrice, do you want to throw something in quickly, and then?
Well, quickly or not, I mean, I do have something to say.
Say it. I'm starting to feel the pressure of the crowd behind me here, who
It's
want
fine.
the floor.
Well, as I was listening, I literally, I mean, I'm listening and was trying to think about something to say that would be relevant to the whole audience. Nowhere am I near to be an expert in these issues. I'm more of a practitioner on the ground and working with youth and whatnot. And you brought the fact that, you know, I'm from Montreal, and even though, you know, from Quebec, even though there are First Nations and Indigenous communities in the province, we don't see them as being more as present as in BC, for example. And we do have this issue of the information that is given to us through education, and the history being described in a way that doesn't portray history through the lens of the Indigenous. So I did learn about all the atrocities very late in my upbringing, in my 20s, as I was a practicing lawyer, actually working on the residential schools cases that went to the Supreme Court. So I had to do that to learn about these issues, which is quite crazy. Now, I think that one of the underlying questions that you're raising through your comment around being from Montreal and not knowing about these things is that notion that even though we're only about 33 million or so, we're not that connected. And there is, and being from Montreal, and je salue tous mon contingent québécois dans la salle, being from Quebec, there is a divide between Quebec and the rest of Canada. And people in the rest of Canada are not fully aware of what is currently going on in Quebec. And we have serious issues related to discrimination and racism that are bringing up a lot of turmoil. Now, from Montreal, we're facing that, and from Quebec, we're facing it as being a Quebec issue. And people, and I've been engaging with some of you people, and it's always framed as a Quebec issue, but this is not a Quebec issue. This is a Canadian issue, and I don't see that yet as being a Canadian issue at all. And I think that when we talk about building bridges, we're talking about First Nations, but we should also engage with Quebec issues in a way that doesn't create that divide between the French and the English.
Yes. You're totally right, and it's quite interesting to see, you know, my generation spent a lot of time on Anglophone, Francophone issues. Those were the great issues of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And in a way, when you went and talked to your indigenous friends, they said, wait a minute, you know? And that's one of the reasons that the constitutional reforms failed, because we seem to be only capable of handling one issue at a time, or two issues at a time, Anglophone, Francophone. And so now the frame is moved to indigenous issues, and of course it's the same thing, nobody's talking about Francophone issues. So we have to be a little more nimble on our feet, all of us, that these things all have to be happening at the same time. I think that's fair.
Well, it's all the same root. It's how we relate to others, and we, you know, the conversation around the Quebec majority indigenous is there's more awareness, and Montreal specifically is more and more working on reconciliation, which is amazing. But yeah, we single pick issues and we try to solve them. Whereas the underlying thing is really how we relate to with each other, in the personal, deep work that needs to be done to be open with others, irrespective of where they're from and who they are.
So, si je peux juste dire, parce que peut-être les autres ne savent pas, mais il y a tout un contingent de jeunes engagés de Montréal qui sont ici dans la salle. There's a whole group of young, engaged Montrealers above all who are here in the hall, who are taking part in all sorts of different events, which is very, very exciting. And I'm going to say one thing which is not often talked about in Toronto or Ottawa, which is that when we're talking about treaty negotiations, and I'm going to look nervously at Niigaan when I say this, but but of the, say, three most modern treaty settlements, new treaty settlements of the last 30 years, two of the three happened in northern Quebec. And they were really driven by Quebecers, so the Bay James and of course the Northern Cree Agreement, which is one of the most important done in the country, and then Nunavut. And what would you say the fourth is?
Well, I would just say the BC treaty process is the
Well,
most
the whole
modern.
BC treaty process, absolutely. But, okay, so to the floor.
John, we have Haroon first, and then I'm going to pass the cube down to there, and then...
So, Haroon Siddiqui.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I just want to add...
Raise your mic.
Sorry, I just want to add one more dimension to it.
More, Haroon.
Besides the traditional tensions between the Aboriginal peoples and the settlers who came to this country, and the tensions between various groups throughout our history, as we have seen through the Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians, and so on, we do have a new tension which is not being talked about, and Professor Sandel also did not mention it, which is really what is giving rise to the great populism south of the border and across the United States and across Europe. And this is the biggest bridge that needs to be built. In varying degrees, we have white folks feeling threatened by brown immigrants coming into the country. And this is what the wall with Mexico is all about, which is what Le Pen is all about, which is what Geert Wilders is all about. I think this topic is posing the greatest challenge to what we thought was a liberal democratic consensus in the Western lands, that we have a consensus that more people will come in and we can argue about the morality or the methodologies of immigration and so on. But what is gnawing at our societies these days, this extraordinary tension which is giving rise to populism, and I think we need to address it. This is the biggest bridge that needs to be built at this time because it gnaws at the very central consensus of a liberal, pluralistic democracy.
Let's just hear from it, and then we'll come back to you.
Vanakkam, which in my language Tamil means hello. My name is Kumran. I'm a young advisor to 6 Degrees. I was just struck by something that Ausma spoke about in terms of our history of the way we've treated our First Nations relatives, and the refugee crisis we are in is a reflection of other kinds of colonial struggles that have happened in places far, far away. And when she said that, I'm reminded of what an Indian politician, Sashi Tharoor, spoke up at Oxford about reparation. And I just wanted to place, at the risk of this being a very abstract meditation, I also think that bridges is about what we really mean by that. And at the risk of not building hollow bridges, I'd like to ask the panel, how do you react to What's your position on reparation, and what do you think needs to tangibly happen, possibly even as an outcome of this conference, that could help us build hopefully stronger bridges and not hollow ones just on words? Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I think that's me. Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a medical student at McMaster. So I just want to say to Dr. Caron, you're kind of a rock star to our cohort. We hear a lot about you, and I'm excited that you're here and I get to listen to you. Also, today is our session on Indigenous health for professional competencies, and unfortunately I'm missing it, but thankfully I get to be here and participate in this conversation. So given all of what you have all said, I have a comment/question. There is a lot to be done in terms of building understanding, especially within healthcare, about how to work with Indigenous folks, how to be allies to Indigenous folks, and how to properly address the generational trauma that they face and how that is manifested in their health. And I would, as someone who's a settler to Canada, I came about 6 years ago, and I've been learning and trying to understand, and as also a Black woman, trying to understand how issues of racism exist within Canadian society and what I can do to address those. Clearly there's a common theme of allyship and how we all need to work together and try to tackle what is truly, with a capital W, this white supremacy that we face within the Canadian context and also just maybe North American and the international framework in general. And I would love to hear your ideas and thoughts on how we can build that together. Because sometimes one can feel very inadequate working alone, and I would love to know what experiences you folks have had that can bring to the table.
John, just in advance, perhaps, we have a question for Nadine Rockstar from York Woods as well.
And she's going to sing.
And it relates to your observation question. So why don't I throw it in and see if you can incorporate it. What do you think is the most efficient way to proceed with enhancing true Native representation across the board, which may lessen dependence on allies to promote Indigenous rights? So see if you can put those two together, maybe that would be.
I just have two comments I'll say quickly, but I did actually, I wrote about this in the, what was it called again, Charlie? What's the name of that?
The Globe series?
The Globe series?
It's not very original. It's Walls, Bridges,
Yeah,
Homes.
so Walls, Bridges, anyway, so I think there's copies floating around, but
Yes,
the pathetic little men walking around with Kmart torches, I'll say a few words about that. The real issue there is surrounding around an ongoing system of colonialism and the perpetuation of a delusion that they're the inheritors, and it's manifest destiny. It's the apex of manifest destiny when I look down to the United States and I see. Now I say that harshly for a purpose, to both shock and to unsettle people, to go, yes, absolutely, let's call it what it is, but at the same time, we also need to be kind and generous with people who have been taught that they have an inheritance. They've been indoctrinated into a system in which has been a universal failure, and you identified some of it, is that we all need to recognize that for us, and I say us, the royal us, meaning the nation state, as members of this nation state of Canada, we, to have houses, to have certain things that have happened within the country, or to have a country which is often named to be this rich country, people had to sacrifice a lot. People had to be removed, and legally. And it was the foundation of the country has always been on the exploitation of Indigenous peoples, period. And the nation state, the ongoing process of the nation state continues that perpetuation. As I've said, the globalization always comes at the cost of Indigenous people, period. And if we take those two premises and begin to move into other ways, it may just be that Indigenous nationhood and supporting Indigenous nationhood within this country, and particularly addressing the issue of land redress and ongoing genocidal policies that are draconian in nature, like the Indian Act, that replacing those need to be the #1 priority of the country. Returning land, recognizing that Indigenous peoples have a heck of a lot to say about how we can get out of this mess of the Westphalian nation state that creates the men with the Kmart torches. if we turn to Indigenous nations and see the ways in which both constitutions can be written, texts can be formed. When I work in a university, knowledge, what kind of knowledge we recognize, and then the last part, how do we make our laws? How do we make our relationships? And that may just be that going to the airport and drumming people in is as important a policy as a citizenship oath. These things that often should go together, and I think was recognized yesterday. This is just the two things I wanted to say. So Nadine, I think you wanted to say.
Charlie, I'm going to ask for your help to remind me about that point. But Sarah, thank you for coming and thank you for caring about missing your day over at your medical school. It's a great question, and it's certainly something that, thanks to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think all universities at all levels are really forced to look in the mirror and wondering what they are not doing. And unfortunately, we're at a state in Canada, they're really asking what are they not doing, because there's really not a long conversation to talk about what they are doing. And so in the world of medicine and in healthcare providers in general, but I can speak specifically to medicine, there's a lot of work going on frantically, trying to figure out how do we train our future healthcare providers in Canada to emerge from a Canadian institution and be actually responsible and capable to care for all Canadians. And an area and a gap that's been demonstrated on multiple levels is that for Indigenous people. And so curriculum is going into it, like Ausma has sort of alluded to in terms of the other areas of education. So curriculum is going into it, and part of it is really diving right down into the history, because it's hard to know where you're at now if you don't know where you came from. That's a fundamental part of it, and there is this huge gap in terms of what an average medical student understands. And so when a student comes into my office to see a patient that I am so honored to have in my room, I really make sure that they understand this is a right of theirs, and this is the patient owns the space, the patient is the expert, the patient knows where they're from. If they're asking questions like where is their abdominal pain, where's their belly pain, how long have they had their headache, the patient is the expert, because I have no clue. That's why I'm asking the question, and it's really shifting that space. It's hard. We've fought at it at various levels. I won't go into detail, but I can say that the hard part is that there's this great idea about having curriculum. It's a question of how do you make it mandatory? Because generally speaking, if it's not mandatory, the people who volunteer to do this are the ones that actually care already. Recognize the vital nature of how it must be implemented into their profession. And so how do we make it mandatory? In British Columbia, we have the benefit of the First Nations Health Authority. So for those not from Canada or not from British Columbia, it's basically the government, the federal government, has actually transferred their funds to the First Nations Health Authority that has the jurisdiction over the care of First Nations in British Columbia. Unfortunately, it misses the Métis, and we do have a small number of Inuit, but it does actually bring this into focus. And the important part of it is that the First Nations Health Authority is working from the top up. So they're working from the health authorities, just saying that if you want to employ anyone in the health authorities, they have to have this curriculum. And we're working from the bottom down. And I think the biggest part is the space in the middle, the bridges. It's the communities, it's patients, and it's the families that have to demand it. With respect to how do we not rely on allies?
That's it.
It's a brilliant, brilliant question. And part of it is increasing the number of Aboriginal, Indigenous healthcare providers in Canada. And we're doing that in multiple levels by the curriculum in high schools to make more Indigenous people be able to advance into post-secondary institutions. We're doing it at post-secondary institutions to make it important for Indigenous Canadians to have those opportunities. But fundamentally, I think we're at a beautiful space right now. And the beautiful space is this. I don't want to stop relying on allies. I want to have allies, and I don't want to stop relying on them and needing them, because once when I was little, my mom said, Nadine, never lie down and no one will ever walk on you. Never lean on anyone and no one will ever let you down. And then all of a sudden, as I became an adult, my mom said, you know what, forget about what I told you. She said, lean, 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 because the more you lean and the more you ask for help and the more you bring people into your circle, the more successful your your goal and your objective and your journey, the happier you will be in life. And so when I look around and I'm surrounded by non-Indigenous healthcare providers, and they care as much as my Indigenous patient in my office at that moment, that is the purest definition of success in this country.
All right.
So, yeah. Excuse me. Oh. So that notion of allies, building off of what you said, and I fully agree with you. Going back to the work that we do with our coaches, and we have these notions around how to develop their abilities as change makers, and what makes an effective change maker. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking about those three notions that we teach to our coaches that I believe would be helpful to anybody. Those are the three. First of all, being in a position where you always challenge the status quo, and you challenge systems, and you don't accept the status quo as it is, which is one thing. Second thing being to understand and recognize your own privileges and the way you contribute to oppressions. And the third one being, which actually should be the first one, but the third one being recognizing the humanity in each individual and the beauty of each person, irrespective of that person's background and origins. Interestingly enough, it's quite easy to recognize or to see the issues in the systems. Where it always falls apart with our coaches and with some people that I engage with is the deep personal work that needs to be done to recognize your own privileges and to see the other person's humanity. And we're so that our judgment is clouded by, to some extent, our reluctantness. Reluctantness? That's good.
Yeah.
Not hésitation. To recognize how we contribute to oppressions, which is one thing, and to see the beauty of the individual, so that deep personal work is necessary too. And when I think about the need to engage with allies, it's always provided that the other person understands and is able to do that deep work and own his or her own story around how they contribute to it. And I'm talking about this, I'm a man, and as a man, I do contribute to oppressions towards other groups, being women, for example. So that deep work is always necessary.
Talking about allyship, I think that allies are quite important whenever you have a cause that requires a lot of support and a lot of work. But the first step towards allyship is to recognize that you're an ally rather than the center of the attention. And that's why I was apologizing a minute ago when I was talking about sharing the First Nations heritage and traditions with newcomers, because I don't see myself as an expert. I never am. I'm never going to be an expert. I'm never going to know better than you. And I don't want to be the one who's holding the mic from you. I want to be the one who's passing the mic to you. So I believe that immigrants, newcomers are knowledge seekers, are folks who are looking towards integrating into the community with as much power as they can. So they are your best ally because they want to know more. And my job as somebody who knows the importance of this knowledge is, rather than to write your story, to actually point them to where your book is on the shelf. So that's how I see allyship.
John, would you be ready for a few more interventions? All right. I'm going to ask, I have three over here, and then Aisha has one over there. One, two, and then Aisha, and then we'll get it over to you, Emily. I'm going to ask folks to keep it to a minute because we are running short on time already. We're about down to our last 25 minutes or so. Man.
Hi, bonjour. Thank you for being here. My question is about...
So say your name.
Sorry. I'm Giselle Gordon, and I'm also a first-generation settler here. Been living in Toronto since '83. So, my question is about Indigenous languages as potentials and their power to build bridges across the country. And it's primarily directed to you, Niigaan, as an advocate and a leader within Idle No More, and as obviously a fluent Anishinaabewin speaker, but also perhaps to you, Nadine. With the calls to action from the TRC about reclaiming Indigenous languages across the country, we haven't really done very much as a country to really put that into action yet. But it's very clear how important that is for healing trauma and empowering and reclaiming culture. And but I wanted to ask you both what you think. We know what the benefits will be to Indigenous adults and children who had language forcibly taken away from them and their families. But what do you think about it as a bridge building tool across the country if we, along with the other languages that we teach, we also teach Indigenous languages that belong to the territories to non-Indigenous people everywhere. So we would be teaching Tahltan to Colton in BC, Anishinaabe, Mohawk on this side of the country. And I just would love to get your opinion on how you think that could build bridges and change our society.
Do you want to carry on, or do you want to answer straight away?
Let's keep going around.
All right. We have this gentleman over here.
You know, it's worth saying this.
Oh, yeah.
This is a very interesting conversation because we have many guests from around the world, and this conversation is, in a way, about something in a drama inside Canada. But you can't understand the country unless you've heard some of this conversation, because this is central to what's happening here. And for example, there's about to be a law going through Parliament on Indigenous language, which is supposedly a great step forward. I don't know, we'll see, but whether it is or not. But let's go to more questions.
Over here, and then Emily, and then you can address it before.
Great, thank you. Alexander, and I'm a proud member of Métis Nation BC. And I just wanted to really, as we talk about bridges and reconciliation, I really just wanted to unpack a little bit more this definition of allyship, and maybe challenge John a little bit as well in terms of how allyship is being, I think, identified, especially within this conference. And the reason being is that allyship, I think, when used incorrectly and when driven partly by ego, can also give those in positions of power and privilege the opportunity to continue to hold space and to continue to shape those conversations. And I think when we look at some of those interventions that took place this morning, the reason why those 3 interventions took place is because those individuals and the Indigenous peoples in this room, myself included, felt as though we were being spoken for, rather than having an equal seat at the table. And so as we talk about bridge building, what I really want to know is how can we, when we talk about allyship, because it is important and it is needed, but how can we ensure that allyship is one in which Indigenous peoples are actually the ones to be leading those conversations, and that we can actually be moving forward together in a good way? Thank you.
My name is Amin, and I came a long way from Calgary, which in the context of people from all over the world here may not seem far, but many people didn't know where Calgary was. When I spoke with my American counterparts sometimes where I was from, they asked me a question, is that near Toronto? Well, it's 3,000 miles away. Anyway, I've lived in Canada for the last 39 years. And my parents came to East Africa on a steamship from India. And so we were born and grew up in East Africa. And I'm very grateful for Canada to welcome us to be a part of this society and this community. I have been both proud and humbled by being a part of the expanding circle because I believe in the work of ICC and 6 Degrees in reaching out to people and making the action that is required to be a part of that conversation. And I appreciate that. My question is more about building bridges in the future. We have lots of bridges now that work, that are amazing, but is there any thoughts given to bridges of the future? Because it reminds me of the communication poster that we sometimes see. One side of the bridge is building in a direction and the other one is coming from the opposite direction. Unfortunately, they don't meet. So we need to have something around the design of the bridges. And to me, that is intention that comes from both the sides. Sometimes we start building bridges with an intention, but we don't get anywhere. So any thoughts on the design of building bridges of the future?
Hello, my name is Emily. Bonjour. I'm also I'm part of the Montreal squad. I would just like to question the usefulness of the bridge metaphor. One of the things that's been said is that we seem to have a problem with this country of having different conversations at the same time, and perhaps the bridge metaphor is one of those problems, because a bridge is only a point between two fixed points. And also, because Canada is home on native land, are we actually talking about two fixed points? Because we're actually more talking about a people that superimposed itself on another people and on their land. And so there's ways in which perhaps the vocabulary we have to talk about what keeps us separate is not two-dimensional. There's also a third dimension of power and how that works, right? So how do people have isolated themselves into towers? How do we destroy those towers so that people come down, and it's not necessarily looks like a bridge, but perhaps it looks like a ladder, perhaps it looks like dismantling gates. And so if we do not have a proper language to understand the architectures that were built, the architectures of oppression that were built to keep us apart, perhaps we cannot destroy that architecture or change that architecture to make sense, to make sure that we can build relationships that are based on mutual respect. So what other language could we bring forward to understand what has been keeping us apart and what has kept us from respecting each other and understanding each other?
So we have little time, so let's go really jazzy. And and I think those are all really great interventions, all of them. And so reactions, thoughts.
Let me start. So this is the last round?
No,
this is
not yet.
round. Okay.
But there's one more thing I want to bring in, which
All right.
I think we've walked away from. So I'd like to get it.
So a bunch of things. Just want to say I do an activity in my first year class. So I do the first year class at the University of Manitoba. 200 students, about 3/4 of them non-Indigenous. By the way, 2,200 self-declared Indigenous students at the University of Manitoba, just under 10% of the entire student population. That's regardless of underfunded schools, devastating ongoing colonial policy, and an ongoing draconian Indian Act. Imagine what it would look like if we didn't have that. Just imagine, just for a moment. And so some of this, so what I say to my first year students is, I know every single one of you has Indigenous names, and I'll say it to you. Every single one of you has Indigenous names that are fundamental and foundational to your part of your identity. If you took out your driver's license right now and I said, who are you? And you started positioning yourself, remember we're talking about positioning yourselves, you carry it too. Whether you're here 10 minutes or whether you're here 10 generations, it doesn't matter. You have Indigenous names. It doesn't make you Indigenous. It makes you having a foundational relationship with Indigenous people. And for you to understand who you are, it would take time to look at your driver's license and study who you are. You'll carry, in Manitoba, I say to my students, you have 3 names. You have Winnipeg, which talks about the water, the power that's in that water. Manitowabo, the power that is the power that comes from the life of the water, but also what's been set down into creation, Manitowabo, where Creator sits. Nothing more Indigenous than 2 names for the same place. And then third is Kanata, which you carry as well, and you also carry other Indigenous names on your driver's license. For you to understand who you are, and what I say to my students, for Indigenous students, you're going to learn a little bit about context of your experience, and you're going to begin to put some pieces together. But for Canadians in my class, you're going to learn how to become a better Canadian, a more responsible Canadian, a more ethical Canadian. And that's what Indigenous Studies does. And so languages is a fundamental part of that. Notice that everything I talked about was language there. If you understand Indigenous languages, you understand your relationship to place, your inherent and foundational relationship to place. There's no better, we could talk about law, we could talk about policy, we could talk about history. You do it all in the language. And if you support Indigenous languages, unfortunately we're at the political whim of a government that has no investment, no political will. Historically, maybe perhaps this law may change, however, I have a deep suspicion about that. About a real commitment to Indigenous languages. We still are not an official language within the country, or 642 nations that have those. The other thing I would say is there was a point, about bridges, the metaphor of bridges. So my sister Emily over there, miigwech for that. It was awesome. It's so nice to hear her. I go back to what your image of river is, because we would never, our concept of bridges would be that we would look at the land itself. And notice that two things about rivers don't recognize the armed men at an imaginary line asking you for a passport. Rivers just go. Rivers connect people inherently and through natural law. Second is that rivers also move around things the most. You can try to stop water in the best that you can, but water speaks for itself. And so if we listen to the water, if we look at the way that waters create relationships, we can learn a lot about nationhood. And we can learn about citizenship, and we can learn a lot about the ways that we can connect with one another. So I like your pushing of that metaphor. And fundamentally, I would say that, I think that there is a time in the country, and we are facing it now, where we are still in the era of a lot of firsts in the mainstream of this country. Now, of course, in Indigenous communities, our firsts have been cut off, so now we are redoing our firsts. We have our first doulas. We have our first midwives, and we have our first medicine keepers who are picking those medicines again and taking over our healthcare within our communities and retaking those positions. And colonialism stopped that. But in the mainstream, I think we often forget that I'm the first professor in my family. You're the first surgeon in probably your family and also in the country. My father is was the first Indigenous judge in Manitoba, and so on and so forth. So we are in that era of firsts, and so the mainstream needs to, at some point, recognize that we're capable, and we are happy to take over this dialogue and to lead it in ways in which that can really fundamentally do a lot of the work I've talked about today. So miigwech.
May I? Awesome, great. Actually, okay, so I sat in many a room where people were talking around me about Syrian refugees and referred to them in the third-person perspective while I'm sitting there in the room. So it's quite annoying, and that's why I am going to build a bridge between actually two disprivileged communities, between the First Nations and the newcomers and refugees community, and actually stress on what the gentleman over there, I'm sorry, remind me of your name again? Sorry? Alexander, yes. I would like to stress on the fact that whenever we're talking about those issues, whenever we're talking about the issues of any disadvantaged community, of any marginalized community, the people who should be speaking, the people who have the mic, are the people who are affected the most. And that's why his voice matters, and that's why you folks' voice matters, and I should shut up right now because I'm taking over your time.
So on the point of allyship and just picking that up, and also I didn't want to skip over the previous round of questions. There was one about reparations and about, white supremacy feeling emboldened. And, there is this kind of trite little meme that's been going around in our current context, which says something like, when you've always experienced privilege or entitlement, equity or equality feels like oppression, right? And I think that actually does encapsulate a lot of what we're seeing. And to the question of, why are these white dudes with tiki so annoyed, right? They are a political tool for someone's, grasp at power, and that we always have to kind of remember that. But when we think about the question of reparations or what does allyship actually mean, it means that for all of us, in recognizing our privilege, it's what are we willing to give up if we're really about reconciliation and coming to terms with very hard truths that we're all implicated in, and we do need more sound metaphors that help us kind of engage those really tough conversations. And reparations is a very interesting way of looking at it. I mean, in the civil rights movements in the States, that has been a long-standing and very deep conversation, but I haven't heard very much of it in Canada. And what does reconciliation look like when we have to give up something as settlers, as people who have been here for a short time or for many generations? Is it about giving that up? Is it about ceding power? Is it about actually listening and actually centering the voices that are so marginalized? Is it about sitting in a room and saying, the person who should be doing this, why are they not here? Why don't they have clean water or a school to send young people to? And I think that those are very tough questions for us to ask, and I think that this will be a conversation beyond as well. I also heard from a lot of questions, who is doing the work and how do we find our entry points into the work? And they didn't ask me to do this, but I do want to give a shout out to some really amazing initiatives that I've been able to witness and be a part of, especially for young people. One of them, and I know that folks are here from there, but Canadian Roots Exchange does an amazing program between Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth in cities like Toronto that might feel very separate or theoretical in terms of our relationships with Indigenous communities. And it's really powerful in the way that you engage deeply and at those very early and formative years. And I also want to give huge credit to the Inspirit Foundation that has prioritized truth and reconciliation and also anti-Islamophobia as their priorities, not just as two separate bridges that are going in different directions, but also how do they relate to each other, how are they a network, and how when we understand each other and those struggles can we make a difference. So huge credit to both of those organizations.
And I do agree it is important to target specific issues and find ways to address them specifically. And I think that this is partly what we're doing. And building off of what you just said, going back to the youth. So the risk of just targeting specific issues without working on a shift in individual mindsets is that there will always be different issues that will come up as we face different interactions with different groups. And, I briefly mentioned Quebec, that problem that we have with Islamophobia is really present. And I mean, we aren't discussing that right now, and my intent is not to discuss it specifically. But thinking about what you said, connecting Indigenous with non-Indigenous, when I think about being from the education sector, how to solve this and how to do those reparations, how to have a different shift in mindset, two things always come to mind. The first one is to bring mixity at a very, very young age. So you just addressed it. If we are able to destroy the walls in many shapes or forms, whether they be geographically, whether it be among different groups. For example, I went to school in Montreal. I never went to school in regions. So I don't have a deep understanding of regions because I don't have a personal connection with those regions. This is an issue that we should be facing at a very, very young age, getting individuals to connect with each other, which is one thing. The second part is, and those from the education sector also would recognize this, is we've failed on the goal of developing the human as a holistic individual. And there's tons of knowledge, so we know tons of things. But if we want to have humans who are able to be empathetic, to be compassionate, working on kids' emotional abilities or skill set at a very, very young age is key. So what I'm just mentioning now may come sort of off topic, but to me this is key. If we don't do that work, there will be another 6 degrees 20 years from now, and with youth that will become adults and that won't have that skill set to actually address the issues that we're currently faced with.
So we just have a couple of minutes, and I make one comment, if I may, which is there's a slight danger in there's no such thing. Truth and reconciliation, there is no such thing as reconciliation without restitution.
Yes, yeah.
Right? I mean, I think that has to be said. There has to be restitution.
Definitely, first of all, the recognition that there needs to be restitution, and then I think restitution actually looks not as scary as it typically looks in the mainstream.
So that's my second point, and just stay with your mic. I mean, that this idea that it's a pie, and that if someone gets something, we lose something. And that isn't really the way it needs to work.
If there's anything that Indigenous people have proven during Idle No More particularly, and clearly I'm invested in that particular movement, and which is ongoing. Idle No More is still happening today.
And which changed the country.
And did change the country 15 minutes at a time in places of profit and capitalism, malls. I mean, notice that nobody bought anything during those dances in the malls. They actually created a country. They actually created what it means to be a relationship or an ally, what it meant to be a family. And so what happened, if there's anything that Indigenous peoples have proven, you'd think that if there's any people who, I don't condone violence, but any people who perhaps have a particular argument for smashing a window or two, or flipping a car, or even, looking at destroying certain vestiges in the country, statues and buildings and so on, but you don't see it. You don't see it. Regardless of the residential school system, regardless of, as I mentioned, all of these draconian policies and procedures that continue to have ongoing assaults on Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples are still invested in this ongoing process of relationships. And we dance in a mall. We dance in a mall to try to change the country. We attend gatherings like this to try to change a country. We believe in relationship because of who we are. Fundamentally, which is what we gave to settlers, what we gave to Canada, is that principle of belief in family. And if we hold that tight, I really believe in my heart of hearts, which is why I keep showing up at these things, is that we can be something different than what we have inherited. And the violence and cycles of violence are very real. Learned behavior is very real, and I have so much appreciation for what you've said about white supremacy and power and privilege. And I love that thing. I'm going to use that, by the way, in my class. And when you hear about equality, that's a foreign concept. And if we believe in concepts of kindness and generosity, but yet responsibility and ethic, and that is what our families should be about, then for me, I think we can begin to turn the page. And that restitution is that scary word, or reparation is a scary word, because everyone thinks they're coming after your house, they're coming after your car, they're coming after your tax dollars. Well, two things. First off, Indigenous peoples pay more tax than most Canadians think, and we are also the fastest growing population, and we will be taking care of all of you in the future, as we have done 200 years ago. Our young people are the fastest growing segment, and not only do we need to train them appropriately and invest in Indigenous young people, but we need to invest in non-Indigenous Canadians and newcomers so that they are prepared to work beside, to pay taxes beside, to sit on the bus driven by, to be led by. In Manitoba, 2 of the 3 political parties are led by Indigenous people. That should just tell you that Indigenous peoples are prepared, and we are ready. We are now taking over in ways that, not taking over in the ways that are scary.
Why not?
We are taking the leadership roles that we have actually always had. Nothing has changed from 200 years ago. You're just seeing it now. And what I've said is that in Manitoba, and I say this, I realize I'm in the center of Toronto, so I love you all before I say what I'm about to say, is Toronto. The things that are happening in Toronto are important, but they're not the center of creation. And in Manitoba, we have this conversation every single day about what it means to be a responsible citizen and what it means to inherit this legacies of violence and try to be something different. And people in the north end of Winnipeg are finding the solutions every single day. And then a national magazine calls that the most racist city in this. You're not helping. You are not helping when we do that. What we are is, in Manitoba, we are leading the country in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, often in places that aren't having these hard conversations. And so that was my little soapbox there. I apologize. So.
No. What we didn't do, but it was the undercurrent, less undercurrent with you, but
overcurrent.
Overcurrent, good current. What we didn't do, which we'll do another time, is to really have that conversation about what are the models of civilization, and in what ways are Indigenous models, Métis, Inuit, First Nation models, in what way have they already influenced what we've got, and in what way are they models that can help us do things differently? And that's a conversation that I don't think we've had in this country openly. We have it in bits and pieces, but it's such an important, and this is in a way your name? Alexander. I mean, this is part of what Alexander was saying, is we have to have this conversation that there are other models. Some of it we have actually adopted without recognizing it or understanding it, and some of it is just sitting there. And we listen to Indigenous people speaking, and there are these models that can be absorbed consciously and can change the directions we're going. And I think that's part of this, really the importance of this this reestablishment of the original conversation between Indigenous peoples and newcomers. So, Miigwech, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
So that is the end of 360 Bridges. Before the panel leaves the stage, I will ask you to make sure that you do stay on stage for a group photograph. And I will also draw attention, you may have noticed that there's a lovely painting on the wall. That is the subject of our next exchange in this very space. Two Ships is the title of this canvas, 12-foot by 24-foot canvas. Kent Monkman is in the house. He will describe the story behind it, all of which, the themes, many of which resonate through conversations that you've just been listening to. I just wanted to let you know about two other exchanges that are happening at the next juncture, which is 3:30. In Seminar 1, again, which is up here, we have an exchange with RBC. They are presenting a new report entitled